Good morning. Welcome, and thank you for joining us at our 2020 Construction Conference Virtual Edition. I'm Jen Ritter-Tomasic, Marketing Coordinator of Events and Proposals at Warden Smith. Before we begin, I do have just a few housekeeping items. We are going to utilize PowerPoint slides during this webinar, and we think it will be helpful for you to be able to see both our speaker videos and the slides at the same time. To do this, you may need to make one adjustment to your view settings. Find the View Options button in the top or bottom of your screen and click on it to see your options. Then choose the side-by-side mode. The slide deck should appear on the left and our videos should appear on the right. You can then slide the separator to the left or the right to adjust the size of each view. If you have any issues with sound or video quality during the presentation, please reach out via the Zoom chat feature and I'll try to troubleshoot with you. The last session of today's conference is a roundtable and Q&A discussion with all of our speakers. If you have a question at any time during the conference, please type it into the Q&A box and we will do our best to address all questions as time allows. As many of you know, our construction conference is an annual event. It is also our longest running conference. I'm proud that we are able to continue the tradition of this conference in 2020, albeit virtually. The core foundation of every one of our firm's conferences is to provide you with value. We want you to come away from today's conference with tools that will help you build, grow, or sustain your business. Our first session today is a rapid fire legal update. I would like to welcome all of this session's speakers, beginning with Ken Gray. Ken leads our labor and employment practice group, and his practice experience encompasses various areas of employment-related litigation. Next is Evan Musselwhite. Evan is a litigator who works predominantly in the area of construction law. Meryl Jones is a business attorney who has extensive experience representing contractors, design professionals, and project owners. Also joining us is Bill Durr. Bill is a litigator who has represented clients in a broad variety of complex construction, business, and commercial disputes. Tom Zimatix joined our firm recently, and in the last few months has spent much of his time focusing on PPP matters. Luke Tompkins is a commercial litigation attorney whose practice focuses on commercial and construction litigation and disputes before the North Carolina Business Court. And the final speaker of the rapid fire session today is Whitney Campbell Christensen. Whitney is both a government relations attorney and a lobbyist. This group of speakers is not only a cross-section of many of our firm's practice areas, but we also have representation of 4 out of our 5 North Carolina offices. Again, welcome to today's conference. I'll turn the mic over to Ken Gray to kick off the rapid fire legal update.
Thank you, Jen. In 2020, COVID-19 has turned our world upside down like no other event that we've ever experienced. And that's never been more prevalent than in the workplace. For example, anytime I'm in the office and I'm around other people, or if I'm in the courthouse, I have to wear this mask anytime that I'm not speaking. So that I am protecting others. And so the majority of what I'm going to talk about today, it relates to COVID-19 issues in the workplace, but I will hit on a couple of recent developments in other areas at the end of my presentation. The first thing I want to talk about is the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is a federal law that was passed in March of this year. And it applies to all employers that have less than 500 employees. Now, there are some on this call that do have more, and so I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. But the primary issue that we're seeing confusion on is, when are benefits due under the FFCRA? And the answer to that is there's only 5 circumstances. 1, a government mandated quarantine or isolation order. For example, the health department tells an employee you must quarantine for X number of days. That triggers number 1. Number 2, a health provider orders the employee to self-isolate or self-quarantine. Number 3, an employee is experiencing the symptoms of COVID-19 and is seeking a medical diagnosis. So not only must they be experiencing symptoms, but they must also be trying to determine if they are positive or not. Number 4, an employee has to care for someone who is subject to a government or health provider isolation or quarantine order. And number 5, and finally, the employee has a son or daughter whose school or their child care situation, whether it's a daycare center or a person that typically would have come into the home, is no longer available. So the school is closed or online, virtually, working remotely, and a daycare or child care is not available as it was prior to COVID. Those are the only instances in which the 2 weeks of paid sick leave would be due. And that last trigger, a person having a son or daughter whose school or child care is closed, is the only trigger that gets you to the paid FMLA, the additional 10 weeks of paid leave. Now, any leave that's paid pursuant to the FFCRA is going to be something that an employer can take a tax credit for, but this is in addition to the paid leave that you would otherwise give an employee. So if somebody gets 2 weeks of vacation and 1 week of sick leave, they're still going to be entitled to that same paid leave in addition to this leave from the federal government that you have to pay, and then you can subsequently get your tax credit. The other point I want to make is you cannot retaliate against somebody for requesting or taking this leave. So even if the person isn't entitled to the leave, you still can't retaliate against them for trying to avail themselves upon that. Now, there may be other reasons that we can take adverse action, but that's something that has to be considered in a different scope. Next, I want to turn to the way that the EEOC, which is the federal governmental agency that oversees anti-harassment and discrimination claims in this country, how they view COVID-19. And there is more leeway than with other medical conditions. There are many permissible inquiries that employers can make regarding their employees. For example, it's okay to ask somebody if you're experiencing any of the symptoms of COVID-19, such as, have you had a fever? Do you have a cough? Are you feeling fatigued? Have you lost your sense of taste or smell? Typically, these are not things that we would be asking employees, but you can do that. You can ask if an employee has been exposed to anybody that has tested positive for COVID-19 or is showing symptoms of COVID-19. You can take employees' temperatures, which is something that every employee at Warden Smith that comes into the office has to get their temperature taken at the beginning of the workday. If someone is, if you suspect someone of potentially being positive, you can mandate they get tested and that they produce a negative test. If a person is positive, you have the right to tell them that you can't come back to work until you can produce a negative test. And take that a step further, if an employee's family member who lives in the same household tests positive, you can require that the employee provide a negative test for that positive family member, and then they then the employee get tested and be negative as well. So you can take things a whole lot further than typically you would with other situations. Now, in the workplace, the EEOC and OSHA have a lot to say about COVID-19 issues. Number one, you really, if you take nothing else away, make sure that you have either a policy that relates to COVID-19 or at least have put out a memorandum to all employees so that they're aware of what the company's expectations are. And number one, it needs to be stated that you expect employees who may be suffering from the symptoms of COVID-19 not to come to work. And it must be clear that there's no punishment if they do as you request. You know, they notify you that they are experiencing those symptoms, and so that they should not come in on that day. Number two, you need to address PPE. You, in the construction industry, you're very familiar with PPE, and obviously you take safety as a very serious matter. You need to do the same thing with COVID-19 and determine when are masks and gloves required. And one example I can think of with construction is sometimes a bunch of guys are riding in the same truck to a job site. Well, if you got 2, 3, 4 guys in a truck, are you requiring them to wear a mask? If not, and if one of them is positive, then it's likely that the other 3 could get infected. And so then you're going to have a situation. And what we're seeing is, if employees think that a workplace is not doing what it's supposed to do to protect them, they're filing complaints with OSHA, the North Carolina Department of Labor. And we've seen over a dozen of those claims since April. And you got to get out in front of those claims quickly, and you need to be able to show OSHA we do have a policy, or we did send all employees this memorandum setting out the expectations, and here are the things that we're doing to protect employees. And it may be providing hand sanitizer, particularly in areas where people are touching the same things, they're touching the same tools, they may be touching the same water cooler, or we're no longer having a universal water cooler. We're handing out water bottles, individual water bottles, or we're encouraging employees to bring their own reusable water bottles. So we're trying to avoid as much cross-contamination as possible, but you need to have some expectation in place. And if you don't, and somebody does complain, then OSHA will come in, and not only will they look at the COVID-19 issues, but as you know, OSHA will look at all safety issues. So we never like inviting OSHA in. So get out in front of these issues on the front end. The next issue I want to talk about is accommodations. A lot of times we have employees who are saying, I'd like to work remotely, or I don't feel comfortable with the workplace in light of the safety issues that are still out there. And there are some people that have legitimate concerns. There's some people that have concerns that I do not consider to be legitimate, but we do have to look at the ones that are legitimate. And now obviously a roofer can't work remotely. I get that. Most of the construction industry cannot work remotely, but you do have some folks. You may have bookkeepers, you may have designers, people that can do their job from any place as long as they have a computer. If they make that request for an accommodation, it's something that you need to consider doing, because the EEOC would like for employees to be accommodated if they have legitimate issues, if they feel like they're vulnerable to COVID-19, or they live with someone that's vulnerable to COVID-19. And it takes one more person out of the workplace that might otherwise bring in the virus. So if you can allow employees work remotely and you feel like you can control it, then I would allow that to occur if it makes sense for your business. And then one other update that I will mention from the U.S. Department of Labor is that they have said that if you give hazard pay for people working during the pandemic because labor is short, then you're going to have to include that hazard pay in the overtime calculation if the person does work more than 40 hours in a work week. Okay, the next topic I want to move on to, it would be a topic all by itself for a rapid fire, but for COVID-19. And that's earlier this year, the U.S. Supreme Court in the Bostock decision came down and said that sexual orientation and gender identity are protected just like race and religion and disabilities are protected. And so you need to make sure that your folks understand this and you do not have the joking going back and forth about people that based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And we expected sexual orientation to be protected. Gender identity was a little bit of a step beyond where we were anticipating the court was going at this time. So you have to be prepared and make sure your frontline guys are not, joking Stephen if Stephen all of a sudden wants to become Stephanie and undergoes a procedure. Then we have to get everybody in the right mindset that Stephanie is now our coworker and she is a she and no longer a he. And you have to be able to get the pronouns right. So you need to make sure your people are trained on that. And then finally, we've had a lot of racial issues come up in the national news with police killing of Black people. And then there's been protests and some of those protests have turned into riots. And we've had a lot of employees who are commenting about these issues on social media, and they're making comments in their personal time and they feel like they can say whatever they want to say. They can't. And there have been a lot of people that have lost their jobs because of things they put on social media. So your folks need to have a social media policy, and your folks need to understand that it applies to things even when they're not on the job. And then finally, for some of you who are federal contractors, President Trump in the last month came out with an executive order that prohibited certain types of training relating to sex and race discrimination, where the trainers were making either men feel like they're responsible for all the problems that women have, or that white people are responsible for all the problems that Black people have. And he said that's going too far. And so you just need to be careful about the trainers that you get or the training materials, and make sure that it's a very neutral type training mechanism. And with that, I will turn the mic over to my partners, Evan Musselwhite and Merrill Jones.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Merrill Jones, and Evan and I are going to talk about some construction contracting issues that we've been seeing since the pandemic. We're going to focus on two issues today. One deals with price increases and the other deals with delays in the construction process. I'm going to talk about price increases. One of the biggest complaints that I've heard from our contractor clients is that prices are going up quickly. I've heard it especially with lumber, that you can't get price quotes for more than a certain amount of time, and it's creating problems in your normal way of doing things and quoting jobs. So what we've been faced with is how do you do it? How do you protect yourself when you have rapidly escalating prices? You may recall that this happened back probably 10, 15 years ago, at least with steel. And I'm hearing it with lumber now and other materials due to just shortages out there. So the prices are going up on these products. What do you do to protect yourself? There are really three different strategies that we have seen. And one of them is it's an escalation clause in the contract where you get the right to raise your price if the prices that you're receiving go up beyond a certain amount. What the key to making all this work, I know that you're probably thinking, well, my owners aren't going to go for that. And some probably won't. Some may be more reasonable. I think if we continue to have the problems that we're seeing on the price escalation, everybody's going to have to just learn to live with it. And the key to living with it's going to be, how do you make it fair for everybody? If you can share the risk of the price escalation with the owner, then everybody's being treated fairly. And that's how you sell these different types of provisions that you may put in your contract. So the first strategy that we have used is give yourself the right to raise the price. If your price for buying a product, it goes up over a certain percentage, you get the right to raise your price with the owner. The other thing that we do is and we've seen it used, is you could create an allowance. So for example, if your lumber prices are skyrocketing and you're only getting a quote from your supplier for 10 days, what you could do, rather than giving a fixed price for whatever you think the lumber is going to be in the project, turn it into an allowance. And then if there is an increase in the price and it costs more than what you quoted, you pass it directly through to the owner. How do you keep it fair and sell it to your owner? The key is that you don't increase your markup along with the escalating price of lumber. So you lock in your markup, your profit and overhead on it, because likely those items they're not changing. Your cost isn't going up, and you just basically pass through the increased cost of the materials. That's how you make it fair. If you're going to be successful in doing that, you're going to have to be very careful to document the prices and keep the owner informed. And as the prices go up, you let them know. So you set a baseline price, you make sure that you're transparent about the whole process. And that's, all of this is about selling something. We sell things, we sell our services. You contractors sell to your owners, and it has to be palatable. So I think if you can explain it, be transparent about it, then you have a better chance of getting something which is fairly unusual in a construction contract, which is a escalator on items like lumber. The other thing that you could put in your contract, and it's a little bit more aggressive, but give yourself a way out. Most all of the contracts, especially the form agreements like AIA, give the owner the right to terminate for convenience with a notice. We can also put a termination for convenience clause in your contract, such that if you can't get supplies, if you're having trouble getting the supplies, or the prices go up so much that the owner is not going to cooperate with you, you can give yourself the ability to get out of the job. So, and all these things you would have to negotiate up front. But the key to all of it is it's making the presentation to your owner that this is a situation that you're all living in, and this is the nature of building something now, and we have to be fair about it. So again, fairness is key. Be transparent and negotiate it up front. Don't be put in a position of having to ask for it later. Let's get it in the contracts at the outset. So I'm going to turn it over now to Evan, and he's going to talk about delays.
Thanks, Merrill. Yeah, the next big issue we've been seeing that we're trying to address up front in the contracts is just delays and disruptions on the construction projects, whether it's labor shortages or regulations, social distancing, decreasing productivity, and that type of thing. And the main clause of your contract that's going to deal with this issue is the force majeure clause. That's the fancy name for it. It's really just your clause relating to your time extension. And it's just something that you need to look at, and you need to make sure that there is a specific provision in there that allows or permits an extension of time for COVID-19 related delays. And the more specific you can make it, the better, so that there's less confusion and disputes about it down the road. And so you can put specific examples in the clause, like supply interruptions, government regulations that might change, that'll affect your productivity and that type of thing. And it's not very hard to do. It's not going to take rewriting your contracts. It's just revising that one clause. And if you don't want to revise your form contract, you can always just attach an addendum to it that can kind of supersede the normal provision in your contract, because most of the standard form contracts actually don't address pandemics. The AIA contracts don't mention it at all. Consensus docs mentions epidemics, and it's a little more contractor friendly, but even that's got a different definition than a pandemic. And so we're advising everyone to take a hard look at their contracts and make sure they've got that protection in there. And to get to Merrill's point about fairness, when you're trying to negotiate these, make it so that it's only a time extension and it's not necessarily getting damages for the delay. And that might make it more palatable to an owner, because at the end of the day, these COVID-19 related delays really are unforeseeable to both parties. And it's not caused by the contractor and it's not caused by the owner. And when you have that situation, it's typically an excusable delay, but a non-compensable one. And so that's the best way to try to speak about it with the owner, that look, it really isn't the contractor's fault. It's not the owner's fault. And the contract time really should just be extended. And the other thing I'll mention is that just because that clause is in your contract, that's good, but then you need to make sure you follow all of your other notice provisions for making a claim, because at the end of the day, if you're asking for a time extension, that is a claim, same as an additive change order. And so make sure you're noting what your time limits are for noticing claims. Make sure you note what the substantive requirements are for the claims. And for an extension of time, you're not going to get it unless the delay has affected the critical path of your project. So it's worth taking the time and effort up front to analyze what the real impact of this potential delay is going to be and how it might affect your critical path and the successor activities that it might affect, to document that and present all that to the owner in your initial notice, and give the initial notice, even if you can't liquidate the total impact of the delay at the time, because it might still be ongoing. Go ahead and give your notice up front. And then once you do realize the full impact of that delay, give another notice, detailed notice to the owner or the general contractor that describes the total impact of that COVID-19 related delay. And then the last thing I'll mention is be wary of inadvertently signing documents that might waive that claim for a time extension during the course of the project. A lot of lien waivers aren't just lien waivers anymore. They've got broad release and waiver language in there for all claims related to the project. So obviously everybody's going to get presented with those to sign with payment applications. And just make sure, if it is a broad lien waiver and you do have a COVID-19 related impact, that you're reserving your claim when you're signing that lien waiver, whether it's just handwriting it in or having a separate attachment that lists all your claims that you can attach to the back of that lien waiver. And so I'm going to keep things on time, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Durr and Tom Zimatics. They have been following the PPP loan issues and forgiveness issues extensively, and I'll turn it over to them now.
Well, thank you, Evan. I appreciate that very much. My name is Bill Durr, and Tom Zimatics, my law partner, and I are going to talk a little bit about the Paycheck Protection Program. I am sure that everyone on this call is familiar with the PPP loan program. I expect many of you have received PPP loans, and that's why we thought it was important to discuss today. Much as Ken Gray mentioned, I will tell you that if in December of last year, even January of this year, you would have predicted that the federal government would have dispersed over $500 billion worth of loans to the workforce, to our industries in 2020, you would have been laughed at and shamed probably. But that's in fact what they've done. As of August the 8th of 2020, we've seen over 5 million loans that have been dispersed nationwide. In North Carolina, there's more than 121,000 businesses that have received loans. And for this group, very interestingly, the NAICS sector for construction was in third place for the greatest number of recipients, both by the number and the amount of PPP loans received since the program was initiated. In fact, the construction industry nationally has received over 500,000 loans. So why are we talking about PPP now? Most of you have received the loans. Hopefully you've used it appropriately. Tom's going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But we really want to talk about really the numbers here of folks that are still under scrutiny from the SBA. So we've got 200 businesses in North Carolina that received, or roughly 200, that received PPP loans in excess of $1 million. And more than half of those received PPP loans in the amount of $150,000 to $300,000. So you've got around 1,200 businesses in the $150,000 to $350,000 range. Now, the SBA has made it very clear they will, and I'm emphasize the word will, they will review all loans in excess of $2 million. So if you are a participant in this webinar and your business has received a loan in excess of $2 million, you should expect that you will be reviewed by the SBA. That doesn't stop there though. The SBA has made it clear that any loan may be reviewed. And what can they review for? Well, they can review for eligibility, necessity, the calculation of the loan amount, the use of the loan proceeds, and the calculation of the loan forgiveness amounts. So even if you're below a $2 million threshold, I think you still have to be very prepared to go through the potential for an SBA review process. So let's turn now and talk a little bit about the really important part of this program, and that is the forgiveness. Because honestly, unless your loan is forgiven, this is just another loan, and it really has a reasonably poor term as far as the payment term. You're looking at a 2-year loan if you applied early on in the program, and a 5-year loan if you received funding later on in the program. So forgiveness is key. And the important piece here is when to apply for loan forgiveness. And Tom and I both strongly believe that the sooner the better for application. If you have used your PPP loan funds, if you have got your documentation all squared away, and if your bank is ready with the loan forgiveness application process, then you should take immediate action and go ahead and apply for that loan. This is going to be a long process, we believe. The SBA is probably not going to act as quickly as we would like them to on the loan forgiveness process. So you just need to apply as soon as possible. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Zimatics. Tom's going to continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Good morning, everyone. And yeah, so many of you have probably, if you've had a PPP loan, you've spent it by now, although your covered period may not end until sometime here in October or later, depending on when you got the loan. And so we are really in the season of applying for loan forgiveness. And as Bill alluded to, even though a borrower may be ready for loan forgiveness, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be finalized here shortly. It could be a long-term process. And the reason for that is when you apply for loan forgiveness, the lender has 60 days to review the application and issue its decision. Thereafter, the lender issues its decision to the SBA, and the SBA has 90 days to review the forgiveness decision and ultimately remit the forgiveness amount to the lender. So even if you applied sometime this month for loan forgiveness, it may not be until late winter or early spring when loan forgiveness is finalized. And so one way to speed up the process potentially is to have your documentation properly and sufficiently along with your forgiveness application. Documentation is a requirement to loan forgiveness. You know, I've said to many that I'm sure many of you are teaching from home right now under COVID, and you probably said to your kids, show your work whenever they have a math problem. That's what the SBA is doing here. They're asking you to show your work. So when you say that you've spent all of the loan between April and August, or April and September, for example, and you've spent it on payroll costs, they're going to want to see documentation for that. And one way to speed up the process is to have that documentation right the first time. So for example, payroll, you're going to want to have bank account statements or third-party payroll service provider reports showing specifically the cash compensation paid to employees. And remember that payroll costs has a specific definition under the Paycheck Protection Program. So it's not enough just to show that you had some payroll costs over the summer. You're going to want to show that you used the PPP loan specifically on the payroll costs allowed under the program. Similarly, you know, full-time equivalent employee calculations is a factor in loan forgiveness. It's not enough to just have a snapshot of how many employees you had at a certain period, unless you're providing documentation for a safe harbor. Rather, you're going to have to go through each period and have a calculation showing the number of full-time equivalents during the covered period and during the previous period, and show the average. So you're going to want to show that FTE number properly when you apply for loan forgiveness. If the lender identifies a deficiency in the documentation, they're supposed to work with you. But again, if you can get it right when you apply, it should speed up the process. Now, Bill also mentioned that loan forgiveness may be denied. So it may be the case for some where they apply for forgiveness, the lender makes a decision, but ultimately loan forgiveness is denied, whether it's because of eligibility, compliance, affiliation issues. And one thing to keep in mind today is remember the timeline of 30 days. When the SBA denies loan forgiveness in full, you have 30 days to appeal it to the SBA under their specific procedure. So even though you have months to use the loan, months to apply for loan forgiveness, if you're denied loan forgiveness from the SBA, not just the lender, but the SBA has confirmed the lender decision or has issued its own decision denying loan forgiveness, you have 30 days to appeal. So keep that in mind. And lastly, anything new on the horizon? One thing that's remained the same with PPP over the last 6 months is that it's always changing. That's still true. There's guidance that's published recently that's addressing certain rules, but at this time, there's no radical change to the program, and forgiveness is generally known, and we know the process. Many lenders are ready now to accept forgiveness applications. So keep up to date on everything, but don't expect any drastic changes to the program in the near future. So with that, I'm going to turn it next to Luke Tompkins, who's going to present on lien law. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill and Tom. Again, my name is Luke Tompkins. I am a construction litigation and commercial litigation attorney out of our Raleigh office. And this morning, I have the pleasure of presenting to y'all on the subject of how our general contractors can avoid the risk of double payment on private construction projects by using the notice of contract mechanism that's provided under North Carolina law. And the double payment issue arises on multi-tiered private construction projects when a general contractor makes payment to the first tier subcontractor, and then the first tier subcontractor does not make the payments that it is supposed to make to its second or third tier subcontractors. So under North Carolina law, the second and third tier subcontractors have the right to recover against using a subrogation lien on real property. And as a practical matter, when the second and third tier subcontractors use that subrogation lien, the contractor is going to be the general contractor is going to be the one who's ultimately going to be liable for any payments that have to be made to the second or third tier subcontractor, because general contractors are generally going to have to indemnify the owner. So this notice of contract mechanism can be used by our general contractors as a trump card in this situation. It allows you, when that second or third tier subcontractor attempts to file that subrogation lien on real property, to say, not so quick, and it's going to allow us to be able to make sure that they cannot recover from you. So given the current economic circumstances, which have appeared because of the coronavirus, this is definitely something that we think our general contractors should be taking advantage of to protect themselves against that threat of double payment. So how does it work? The notice of contract mechanism, to use it, the general contractor, within 30 days of the issuance of the building permit, or within 30 days of the date the prime contract is awarded to it, the general contractor is going to fill out a notice of contract. And we've got a slide at the end that I'll show you. It's a very simple form. The notice of contract is simply going to identify who the general contractor is. It's going to identify the property, the owner, and it's going to have your contact information. This is going to be posted on the project site in a visible location so that people who are visiting can easily access this information and see that it's posted. And then also it's going to be filed with the clerk in the county where the project is located. And it's a good practice for our contractors when you post your notice of contract on the job site, post it in a place where those who are visiting and delivering materials to the site can easily locate it. And also, we recommend that when you post this, go ahead and take a date stamped photo, because just in case there's, the subcontractor were to raise an issue about whether or not you posted it within 30 days of the issuance of the building permit or the award of the contract, if you've got that time stamped photo, it's going to allow you to prove that you did in fact do that. So once the general contractor posts the notice of contract, there's a burden shifting mechanism, and the burden then rests with the lower tier, second or third tier subcontractors. If they want to preserve their right to file a subrogation lien and try to recover if the first tier subcontractor doesn't make payment to them, then they actually have to file their own notice of subcontract, or I'm sorry, they have to mail a notice of subcontract to the general contractor. And that notice of subcontract is going to identify who that lower tier subcontractor is. And it's also going to request that the general contractor provide notice to the lower tier subcontractors within 5 days of each payment that the contractor makes to the first tier subcontractor. If the lower tier subcontractors provide that notice of subcontract to the general contractor, then an additional burden is placed onto the general contractor if they want to have the protection that the notice of contract mechanism provides. And to obtain that protection, the general contractor will then have to serve notices of payments onto the lower tier subcontractors within 5 days of each payment that the contractor makes to the first tier subcontractor. And to do that, you'll just, and again, we'll show a slide here in a second that shows how what the notice of payment form looks like. But to complete this process, you'll mail this. And again, we recommend FedEx, UPS, registered mail with receipt confirmation, because you want to have evidence that you did in fact make these notices of payment. That way, the lower tier subcontractors can't argue that you didn't comply with the notice of contract mechanism. And so again, this is a mechanism that we really suggest for our general contractors to use, especially during this current economic environment. It's going to allow you to protect yourself against the threat of double payment. And although it may sound burdensome, it's one of those things that if you incorporate it into your business practices, it becomes second nature. So making sure that within 30 days of being awarded the contract, you post that notice of contract. And then at that point, the burden shifts to the subcontractor. If they don't provide you with the notice of subcontract, you're in the clear, and you're going to be able to ensure that you don't have to make any double payment because of a future subrogation lien by the lower tier subcontractors. And if they do make a notice of subcontract, then you'll just, again, incorporate into your business practices. I know you've already got paperwork that you're sending out when you're making payments to your first tier. It's just one additional piece. It's well worth any work that's involved to ensure that you don't have that risk of having to pay twice for the same work. And to conclude here, we'll show you quickly the forms that will be used. So here's the notice of contract. Again, very simple form, name and address of the contractor, the owner of the real property, a description of the property, and a name and address of the person that is filing the form. And then again, with the notice of payment form, we've got an example of that as well. And it's, again, a very simple form. It's going to show that you've paid the first tier subcontractor the amount of that payment, the project that it was for, the date of the letter. And by sending this, again, you're going to be able to protect yourself from double payment. But again, for our lower tier subcontractors, recommend as well that when you get involved on a project, please go and check and see if a notice of contract has been posted by the general contractor. Because if you want to preserve the opportunity of having a chance to recover if the first tier subcontractor does not pay, you need to serve that notice of subcontract upon the general contractor. So there's something for both sides to be looking at here. But again, for our general contractors, definitely want you to be able to take advantage of this way to reduce risk and guarantee that you don't have to worry about double payment on your projects. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Whitney Christensen, who's going to update us on government relations.
Thanks, Luke, for the introduction and for that great presentation. I'm Whitney Campbell Christensen, and I've been asked to give you an update on the upcoming elections and our state and federal legislatures. I think we all know by now that there's a little election happening in a few weeks. We're 26 days out, and in true 2020 fashion, it feels like there's a new plot twist daily. With the presidential race at the top of the ballot, we generally can expect to see high voter turnout. But of course, this year, those numbers may be impacted by reluctance to gather at the polls due to the presence of the virus. This hesitation to vote in person is already showing up in early voting numbers, where we've seen a record 341,000 absentee ballots mailed in already in North Carolina as of Monday. Control of the United States Senate is also up for grabs and could be settled right here in our own backyard. In the Tillis-Cunningham race, which is considered one of the tightest in the nation, is also currently the most expensive Senate race in the entire country. Some might also call it the most dramatic, given the developments over the last week from both candidates. Although good for our economy, all of the PAC, super PAC, and individual money pouring in from outside North Carolina into that race is making all of the down ballot races in North Carolina media markets more expensive because that race drives up the cost of securing airtime on television in North Carolina. So this means that the candidates in North Carolina's other races either have to raise more money to get on television or get creative with other formats for spreading their message. Turning to the state legislative races, I think there's a consensus among just about all of the North Carolina political consultants from both sides of the aisle that the Republican majorities in the North Carolina House and the North Carolina Senate could be in jeopardy for a variety of reasons, particularly the anticipated voter turnout due to the presidential race. So to gain control of those chambers, Democrats would only need to pick up 5 new seats out of 50 in the North Carolina Senate and 6 new seats out of 120 in the North Carolina House. And while that's definitely, an uphill climb, I think it's doable. And that's, I think, how most of the political experts feel at this point. So unaffiliated voters continue to be the deciding vote in North Carolina politics. And interestingly, at 33%, now have officially surpassed the number of registered Republicans in the state, who make up 30% of the state's registered voters. Because unaffiliated voters are most likely to live in suburban areas, many campaign strategists believe that the engagement and participation of North Carolina's suburban residents is a key factor in determining our state's election outcomes this cycle. So if you live in suburban areas, you've probably been hit pretty hard with mailers and other forms of election advertising. Urban areas have become almost impossible for Republicans to win in North Carolina, with Republicans losing every North Carolina House and Senate seat in Wake and Mecklenburg counties in 2018, except for 2. Both of those districts bled into adjoining rural areas. On the other hand, Democrats are losing by larger and larger margins each election in the state's rural areas, leaving the suburban areas as the true battlegrounds in North Carolina. I'm sure that you know that the construction industry is supported by several strong political action committees, or PACs, including the CAGC PAC, North Carolina Build PAC, which is run by the North Carolina Home Builders Association, specialty trade PACs, and several regional HBA PACs. Those PACs are really effective and generally focused on donating to campaigns to re-elect traditional allies to the construction industry, supporting leadership from both chambers and both parties, and aiding incumbents in vulnerable seats. As far as races to watch go, there are many close state legislative races that could help decide the House and Senate majorities and have been a top focus for many PACs, including the races of Senator Danny Britt in Robeson County, Representative Perrin Jones in Pitt County, Steve Ross, an incumbent representative in Alamance County, and then Representative John Soka in Cumberland County. Those are generally regarded as, the closest races in the state legislature right now. Obviously, the Cunningham-Tillis Senate race could be a majority breaker in the U.S. Senate. Cunningham has been polling slightly ahead. Sorry, I just realized that was not all the way open. He's been polling slightly ahead for a while, given the latest developments about his personal life and Tillis's COVID diagnosis. Voter behavior in that one could be difficult to predict. ECU poll, a recent ECU poll has Tillis ahead by 1 point. So obviously that's different than how that race has been trending throughout the election. Governor Cooper has held a pretty substantial polling lead over Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest during this entire cycle. That's not too surprising to most of you probably. Most of the construction industry's allies are in relatively safe districts like Representative Dean Arp from Union County, Representative John Torbett from Gaston County, but House Capital Improvements Chairman John Hardister, who oversees all of the major new infrastructure appropriations in the House, is running in a very competitive district in Guilford County, so that's also one to watch. As far as the interplay between the current health crisis and the election goes, we've already seen a record number of voters voting by mail in North Carolina, and I think that will only continue to pick up. The results of the election could also be significantly delayed due to the time required to count the ballots and possibly also due to legal challenges. The election's already in the courtroom as federal judges are going back and forth about how to address missing witness signatures on absentee ballots. And I think that's just the beginning. Voter turnout could be impacted by the virus, particularly if cases begin to spike as election day approaches. The virus has impacted the way candidates even campaign in North Carolina and across the country, as many fundraisers and campaign events have gone virtual, and some candidates have chosen to suspend negative advertising when opponents tested positive for the virus. Overall, I think it'll be an election for the ages and one that will end up in the political science textbooks, maybe even the public health textbooks for decades to come. So shifting gears to Capitol Hill, I wanted to start with a piece of really exciting news. You may have heard that retired congressman has joined our government relations team at Warden Smith, and we are so excited. Congressman McIntyre served in the U.S. House for 18 years from 1997 to 2015, representing North Carolina's 7th Congressional District, which spans the southeastern part of the state. He has a tremendous background in economic development and also has decades of experience working to bring military construction projects to North Carolina as the 2nd ranking member of the prestigious House Armed Services Committee. He also loves a good pun and has a black belt in Taekwondo. Mike can be a huge asset to businesses looking for state, federal, or local economic incentives for construction and infrastructure projects. So if that's something you're interested in exploring, I encourage you to reach out to him. His contact information is on our website. I'm sure you're all up to speed on the CARES Act, the $2 trillion coronavirus relief package that Congress passed in March. That bill included temporarily enhanced unemployment benefits, which expired in July, direct payments to individuals, small business loans, funding for a multitude of public health initiatives, direct relief to states and certain local governments, and support for businesses in certain hard-hit industries such as the airline industry. Congress has been negotiating another relief package for months, but those discussions have started and stopped many times for a variety of reasons, as things do in Congress. Last week, the U.S. House passed a $2.2 trillion bill to provide additional coronavirus relief funding, including the enhanced $600 weekly federal government benefits through January, and providing additional aid for small businesses. The Senate hasn't scheduled that bill for a vote yet, and they appear unwilling to do so, with a sticking point being the amount and duration of unemployment benefits. President Trump proposed a $1.6 trillion package that included $400 enhanced unemployment benefits through December, but the U.S. Senate, again, appears to be uncomfortable with a spend of that magnitude, so the stalemate continues. There are tons of CARES Act resources on our firm's website, and I encourage you to reach out to the government relations team if you have any questions about that legislation, state or federal relief, or if you would like to explore incentives for our projects. Shifting gears to Raleigh, before we conclude, the North Carolina General Assembly is adjourned for the biennium until January. The 2020 short session of the General Assembly adjourned on September 4th after only passing 97 bills this year, which is really low. For obvious reasons, legislative leadership wanted to focus on essential priorities and get out of session quickly in the best interest of everyone's safety. We feel very fortunate that we were able to pass bills for our clients in such a tough year when really very few bills were moving. The construction industry has some really wonderful advocacy groups, as you know, and their priorities for 2020 were to provide more funding for transportation projects and public building infrastructure. It was a challenging time to lobby for both of those things for obvious reasons, but we can talk about those in a minute, but we did see some great progress on the transportation funding front over the course of the summer. The General Assembly's primary purpose in even-numbered years is to enact a revised state budget, but that didn't happen this year for a variety of reasons. First, no state budget was enacted last year due to a standoff between the Republican-controlled House and Senate and our Democrat Governor, Roy Cooper. Last year was the first year in modern history that the state failed to enact a budget, which was obviously significant. Without a new budget, the state simply operated on the previous year's budget from July 2019 to June 2020. This year, with all the same players and less time, lawmakers didn't attempt a budget because all parties expected the same outcome. I think that was a good judgment call, particularly since the delayed deadline meant that state budget writers wouldn't even know how much revenue they had to work with. For example, this spring revenue forecasters projected a $2 billion state revenue shortfall, but quickly that number grew to $4 billion and ultimately settled around $5 billion in state revenue shortfall. For context, the state budget has recently been in the $24 billion range, meaning the pandemic caused the state to fall short on tax collections by roughly 20% this cycle. Many people took that to mean that there would need to be significant budget cuts to achieve a balanced budget, but I've been counseling our clients that the fiscal picture is much better than it sounds for a handful of reasons. First, lawmakers have built up a hefty savings reserve fund over the last decade, as we've run a $200 to $600 million surplus each year for the last few years, and our legislators were wise enough to save that money. Second, because of the failure to enact a bigger budget in 2019-2020 fiscal year, the state spent that year operating on less than it was bringing in, which left hundreds of millions of dollars on the bottom line. Last, the CARES Act appropriated $4 billion to North Carolina for coronavirus relief efforts. We were able to use some of those funds for state purposes. The General Assembly had to appropriate those $4 billion in funds by December 31st of this year to avoid potentially forfeiting them to the federal government. So they distributed them over two pieces of legislation in early summer and late summer. Although the General Assembly passed several mini budget bills in 2019 and 2020 to support certain areas of the state budget that needed additional funding, unfortunately for the construction industry, the capital improvement section of the budget was largely ignored during both years. In 2020 in particular, lawmakers told me several times that they couldn't rationalize appropriating funds for new building projects when the state's financial future was so unclear, and it's hard to argue with that given everything going on. But there's a long list of projects from the capital improvement section of the 2019 budget, which wasn't enacted, that we know are still priorities for lawmakers and expect they'll revisit when normal budget writing resumes, hopefully next spring. And one of those items was something we actually helped lobby for, a new Brody School of Medicine facility at ECU. So we're hopeful that that'll get done next year. On a similar note, the North Carolina House and Governor both proposed large education and transportation bonds for 2020, but the North Carolina Senate was unwilling to take them up because Senate leadership strongly disfavors incurring state debt. Speaker of the House, Tim Moore, his proposed bond included $3.1 billion in new education and transportation infrastructure projects for the state, and although it was released in the throes of the pandemic in May, I thought he made really good arguments for its timeliness. He explained that the cost of borrowing was at historic lows and that an infusion of government funds for construction projects would create jobs and spur much needed economic development in every corner of the state at a critical time. Lots of advocacy groups, including those representing the construction industry and the North Carolina Chamber, did a really great job lobbying for the bond bill, but ultimately the Senate couldn't be persuaded. Many of you probably also followed the unusual situation that played out over the last 12 months with NCDOT's financial position, essentially due to several hurricanes causing significant damage to NC roads, the MAP Act settlements, and then COVID. DOT fell short. They fell so short on revenue that a statutory trigger froze the agency's finances from April through early July, which prevented them from entering into any new contracts or starting any new projects, and also delayed many that were underway. DOT's top source of revenue is from the gas tax, and when North Carolinians abruptly stopped traveling in March, that stream of funding dried up in a way that most of us could have never predicted. Ridership on North Carolina roads at one point in the spring was down about 60%, which meant gas tax revenue for the agency was down by the same margin, which made things for them obviously really precarious as far as budgeting goes. The agency's second biggest source of revenue is DMV fees, and during the stay-at-home orders, no one was renewing their licenses or tags either. And in March, the General Assembly passed legislation to give grace periods on all of those renewals, which only extended the problem. The agency's third largest source of revenue, which was also impacted by the pandemic, is the highway use tax, which is a tax that the state collects on the sale of automobiles. There's never been a time in modern history that North Carolinians needed their cars less than during the stay-at-home order, not to mention so many individuals have lost their jobs or were facing economic uncertainty, so new car sales tanked during that period as well, which was another blow to NCDOT's revenue. So during the summer, each of those revenue streams began to turn around, as you know, as ridership began to return closer to normal numbers, people began to renew their licenses again, And all at once, car sales began to pick up. And then in June, the General Assembly passed House Bill 77 to completely overhaul how the agency manages its finances, put new safeguards in place, and also infused DOT with an emergency cash package. As a result, by July 1, the agency was above the statutorily mandated cash floor again and could begin to restart paused transportation projects. They're in much better shape now, and if you haven't executed an agreement with DOT, you're likely to see it started again soon if it hasn't already. We have several clients in that position, and we've been able to leverage our contacts within DOT to make sure all of their projects are restarted and refunded now that DOT is out of the cash crunch. You can get involved with government relations by supporting your construction industry PACs, participating in their advocacy days and grassroots campaigns, and getting to know your legislators personally. I think that's all the time I have, but if you have questions about any of these topics or would like any assistance with the state legislature, DOT, Congress, or an economic development matter, please don't hesitate to give us a call. So I'll turn it over to Jen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And thank you to all of our rapid fire legal update speakers. Our next session is a construction industry economic update and forecast from Hank Harris, Director of Consulting at Ward & Smith Business Consulting. Hank spent most of his career in a national management consulting and investment banking firm, specialized in working with privately held businesses. He rose to become CEO and chairman of that firm, where he still maintains an affiliation and many friendships. His joining of the Ward & Smith Business Consulting team is somewhat of a passion project, presenting an opportunity to help closely held business owners within his home state of North Carolina. Hank's background gives him a unique perspective. He has seen the inner workings of literally hundreds of successful businesses, understands the mind of entrepreneurs, and has a deep understanding of the issues unique to privately held businesses. Hank, we are thrilled that you are able to join us this morning.
Thank you, Jen. It's nice to be with everybody. Not really, but at least virtually. Maybe we'll be able to fix that sometime down the road. And thank you for that introduction. I will say that I've as Jen alluded to, I've kind of got two hats on this morning. Most of my career was spent, as she mentioned, with a company called FMI, which is where I still have an affiliation. And this material that we're using this morning is all from my colleagues at FMI. And I should mention to you that you're welcome from their perspective to use this any way you want. But if you use it outside the four walls of your organization, the only request would be that you give FMI appropriate attribution for that. But otherwise, certainly free reign to use the material in any capacity that works for you. I will also say that I have been friends with Ward & Smith people for a long time. I've always been a big fan since I got to know Ward & Smith some years back. They are an earnest and honest and pragmatic bunch of people. And so it's a real pleasure for me to be able to spend a lot of my daylight hours working to help them with their consultancy in North Carolina. It's a lot of fun and great joy for me. Having said that, let's dive into what's going on with the big picture of the construction industry, which is my assignment this morning to talk a little bit about that. You might imagine that the market sentiment, and by the way, I won't read all these slides to you. The words are there for you, but I'll just give you a little color commentary on them. You know, the best way to sum up the sentiment right now is probably the same way everybody on this call feels, which is really a little bit of malaise just because there's so much uncertainty out there. And notwithstanding the fact that if you're in the construction business in some way or another, the reality is you've got time. You know, we always have warning. This industry trails economic cycles by about 18 to 24 months. So you know something's coming. The question is what's coming, and that, of course, really none of us really know the answer to that. But certainly our antenna are up. The confidence indexes that you see here are down. The surveys already are starting to indicate that people are experiencing some jobs that are not happening. They're being put off, they're delayed, they're canceled, and so forth. Backlogs are actually quite good. one of the things I do still at FMI these days is I sit on about 5 company boards, and one of them is what I'd call a mid-sized engineering firm. But the other 4 are very large contracting businesses, and they have, the nature of their business is that their backlogs probably tail out, 2, sometimes as much as 3 years. So those kinds of companies, you've got a lot of tail on the backlog. But even they, are sort of antsy. And the question that, in everybody's mind is how do we react going forward? Really respond is probably a better word. I think that, by the way, I don't know if you saw this, but thinking about what's going on right now, there was a funny article just yesterday in the Wall Street Journal where this, the argument right now in Washington is over the stimulus, and they've got a 2,100-page bill that they're fighting over that would basically put $2 trillion out into the economy. And if you happen to see this article, the guy who was writing it said, if you add up all personal income tax and all corporate income tax in a given year, it's about $2 trillion. So the point was, why don't we just eliminate the middleman, and instead of the government putting $2 trillion out and then trying to get it all back, just let us all keep our money for a year. And he went on with all these arguments for it. It was pretty, by the time you read the article, you think this guy's got a really good point, and it's such a smart idea, it'll never happen. But it was interesting context for, what's going on right now with the government cushioning the overall economy. And my big concern personally is what happens to the broader market when there's a grand realization that can't go on but for so long. There's going to be some sort of reckoning, and the question of obviously will be, how bad is that? I tend to be an optimist, believe it or not, and I think that there is an argument to be made that there could be a soft landing for the construction industry. And the way that could conceivably work is that the backlogs being solid take us out into a recessionary period, and it's a short, shallow, fast rebound out of the recession. One thing that potentially argues for that is the fact that this recession, unlike any other, has been caused by an exogenous event. It is not a recession, coming at us from normal market forces. So that could speak to a fast rebound. There's some conflicting signals right now in the economy that argue potentially in that direction. Notwithstanding that, though, is there going to be a recessionary impact on the construction industry and on construction companies? And I think the answer to that unequivocally is yes. May not be too bad, could be like 2001, where for most people it was like kindergarten in terms of a recession. So that's the hope. None of us really know, but you've got to prepare for what's going to be coming down the road. FMI's best forecast right now is, and by the way, if you look at it right now, the 2020 construction total spending will be almost the same as 2019. I mean, it's within less than a percentage point down. So it's literally pretty much flat. It's sustained itself. It'll probably go down in 2021, but not by too much because of the cushion of the backlogs. 2022 is sort of the forecast of when it will likely be felt. Right now, they're saying residential construction down about 18%, non-residential construction down just at 20%, heavy highway, civil, sort of everything else, public sector oriented, probably down about 2%. So, 20% is a broad, if that number is close to correct, that's something everybody's going to feel in the broader market. Right now, gross domestic product, and this is kind of bizarre really, but gross domestic product in the United States, you may know, fell 30% in the second quarter. excuse me, that's 33% the second quarter. It's come back, the estimate this quarter is that it'll be back 30%. So that's a good thing, but what's happened is the economic growth from 2018 and 2019 has been virtually wiped out. So we're eliminated, if you will. Merrill, in his comments earlier, mentioned inflation with materials, and that's already a current concern. One of the things I think that's going to make it more of a concern in 21 and 22 is that the Federal Reserve can't agree amongst themselves about exactly what to do, and they're pretty much out of bullets in terms of fighting inflation. And the only way they can fight it is raise rates, which they have committed not to do. So there's going to be some broad inflationary impact that will likely be on the backside of this recession, which will make Merrill's comments about how you manage your material risk to be really, I think, critical on a go-forward basis. Let's talk a little bit about public markets, and I want to take a quick segue into that. If the public spending is good, and we go to this next slide about home run, and this is more about public markets than it is private, but it does speak to a couple of different economic scenarios. You know, the best case scenario would be we get a vaccine, we get an infrastructure bill, the economy normalizes, and people start moving around and getting back to their normal lives. If those three things were to happen together, that would be a home run, certainly for the public markets, and probably by extension for the private markets as well. And that's probably best case scenario, really for the industry when you aggregate it. Second slide here talks about what if it goes the other way, and a lot of those things don't happen. We're slow getting our hands around the virus. Things don't happen in 2021 the way they're being discussed right now. And we don't get an infrastructure bill or a transportation spending bill at the federal level, or we at least don't get a major one. All of those things would probably have a negative impact and make it for a slower recovery and probably a deeper slog in terms of construction industry recession. Let's talk about the actual shape of things right now. And you can look, construction industry, you see three different scenarios here. You know, best case, we go up to about $1.4 trillion. Mid case, 1.2 trillion. Worst case, 4-year decline, at 834 billion, which would be the same trough as we were at the Great Recession. That's a steep fall, by the way, for the overall industry. The construction industry in a normally good market, normal to good market, will be pushing 8 or 9% of gross domestic product. When it falls to that latter scenario that you see there, probably about 6% of gross domestic product. And that's a big difference in overall industry spend. Now, this industry is hopelessly disaggregated. What does that mean? Well, it means, number one, nobody's got any meaningful market share, but also number two, all these broad statements I'm making don't necessarily translate on the ground to what could be happening in a specific company, a specific geography, or a specific type of construction. It's more like a mutual fund, really, as a way to think about it. Some sectors, even in bad times, will continue to spend, and some won't. The thing that I think that happens with the broad economy impact on construction is that it pushes competition into the places where the money is, and then there are more bad deals. So everybody feels it some way or another, but it's a very fragmented kind of a situation. So go back to that slide, if you would, for just a second. I want to talk a little bit more about this recovery shape. There are just some things that came out this week and didn't make it onto the slide. The latest discussion is that the real shape of the recovery is now being discussed as a K shape. And you may have heard this, or you may have read about it this week, but if you could visualize the letter K, what's happening right now is that the upper part of this, part of the K that goes that way, you've got well-off, well-educated people that are dealing in the digital economy, or people that are dealing in businesses that supply some sort of domestic necessity. Those businesses and those people, by extension, are doing very, very well. There are businesses, including in the construction industry. I mean, the boards I sit on, honestly, you know, right now, everybody's doing really, really well. Even the companies tied to some fairly difficult public spending challenges. There's no current problem. So same thing you see in other businesses. Let me give you some interesting statistics here, because a lot of this has to do with the ability of a business to continue getting things done. College educated people and up, February of this year to September of this year, in February, a lot of jobs started to be lost. How many of those jobs were brought back by September? If you're college educated and up in the workforce, almost 100%. High school graduates, 88%. Non-high school graduates, 82%. So there's a definitive correlation between, education, nature of what you're doing. And a lot of those people really, it's almost like, well, we're getting things done on Zoom calls and we're just, we just keep going. Well, the bottom part of the K is not that way. And, we all think about how our lives are lived. You go to the dry cleaners, you go to the Starbucks, you go to the restaurant, whatever it is you do in your day-to-day living. Well, there's a whole sector of the economy, and it's actually most people that are in the bottom part of that K. They can't work from home. They're not educated on a comparative basis, and they're not in sectors that are spending. They're in sectors that are being hit hard. Now, when you take it's kind of the 80-20 rule, really. 80% of our population is in the bottom part of the K. I don't think you can have the entire 80% feel what they're feeling right now and not have that eventually affect everybody else. It's going to one way or the other. And that's why I think that there's no way that we're going to avoid some recession in this industry and otherwise within the next 18 months or so. I think hopefully it'll be shallow. I'd love to think it's going to be shallow and quick. There's an argument that it certainly could be, but I think you've got to get ready. So let's talk about getting ready and just talk a little bit about, are you playing offense? You playing defense? How you thinking about this? Things that you can think about from an offensive standpoint. I would say that if you're going to go diversify, if you were brave enough to go out and buy a company in this environment, which sounds a little crazy. Most companies are sitting around right now, as they should be, talking about how to preserve cash. And heading into what we're heading into, cash management and cash preservation is the absolute #1 priority for everybody in America, as far as I'm concerned. So it's the right thing to be looking at. And it would take a brave soul to go out and take cash and turn it into goodwill and make an acquisition. But the flip side of that is there are companies with dry powder out there, big balance sheets. And if they can do that and manage their balance sheets effectively and make that happen, it would be a buyer's market probably in the next couple of years. So it could be, for some companies, potentially the right thing to do. Some companies may decide organically, we've got to get into a different kind of work, or organically, we've got to go to a different place. Nothing wrong with any of that thinking. It may be even necessary, but you need to be thinking about strategically how you do that. The wrong way to do it is, I've never done any work in Charleston, South Carolina. Let's just go down there and bid low. I honestly can't believe there's still people in the marketplace that will do that in today's world. That's an expensive way to try to beat your way into a marketplace. Smarter way to do it, follow a customer, do the market research, do a joint venture, find some people from the community and hire them. There's got to be a better way than deciding that you're going to low bid your way into a market like that, especially in a down economy where a bad job could really be a lot worse because you don't have the good jobs to offset it. So be careful about how you think about those kinds of moves. Take a hard look at your balance sheet. This probably sounds a little bit more defensive than offensive, but the balance sheet right now is a critical thing to look at. Everybody I know is talking to their bankers right now. Everybody I know, even companies with a lot of money, are looking at how do we make sure we've got, excess borrowing capacity, even if we don't need it. If you ever need it, you can't get it. So right now is the time to make sure that's in place. I'm surprised by the number of companies I talk with, and we say, well, what's your debt picture like, look like? And they start telling me about their line of credit. Well, if you're a contractor, especially, I'm glad you have a line of credit. It's a good thing. It's everybody should have one. But you draw on that line of credit, you get cash, and then you get a current liability. For the most part, I think a lot of companies ought to be looking at long-term debt. Long-term debt is cheap. You put dry powder on your balance sheet. You got an asset. As soon as you draw it on it, you got an asset called cash. Most of your liability stays long-term, and you don't hammer your working capital. So it's a smart thing to be thinking about those kinds of things right now and making sure that you're ready for whatever we have to get through. Let me talk about the defensive side. That probably is a good segue into the defensive side for just a minute. One of the fellows that I sit on a board with, he used to run the infrastructure business of Balfour Beatty, who most of you are probably familiar with, big British contractor in the U.S. But he actually, we had a meeting about a week or so ago, and he walked us through what he called the 5 circles of risk. And it was interesting. It was just the way he had looked at it in his career. And it was very similar to a study that we had done back in the 90s on why large contractors got into trouble. But he said there's 5 circles of risk. One of them is you get a job, do you have the team? You've got a team that's done this kind of job together, kind of like a sports analogy. They know how to work together. Second thing is we've actually done a job sort of similar to this before. This kind of project would not be novel to us. The third circle of risk was the client or the customer. Who is it we're doing business with? We either have done something for them or somebody like them, or we've done our due diligence on them, but we feel good about whoever that client is. The fourth circle of risk was the contract. What is the nature of the contract that's getting foisted upon us? Merrill spoke earlier about fairness. Some people play fair and some people don't. And I think you get a view of that in your contract negotiations sometimes in terms of just basic reasonableness. And what kind of risk are you willing to open yourself up to in that regard? And then the 5th circle of risk that he walked us through was geography. Most construction markets are provincial in some way or another geographically. And if you haven't done business someplace before and all of a sudden you show up to do a project, you've got potentially a lot more risk than you might be understanding that you're getting yourself into. And so the point he made was if he was ever more than 1 circle of risk away, he would just decline. They just wouldn't pursue the job. My only point here is these are easy things to talk about, but when you're in tougher times, you get tempted and you say, okay, we really need work. We need to keep the team together and the pressure is on. But in a tough market, there are going to be more bad deals out there. And you just have, there's no magic answer to it, but your due diligence on what you take in and your care about your risk management in just about every respect, I think is going to be really, really key to getting through tough times. We always used to say that contractors don't need to make a lot of money in a really bad market. But they need to stay in the black. If they at least stay in the black, they're always the same companies that'll kill it when the market turns around in the right direction. So be really, really careful about that side of things. somebody mentioned COVID risk too earlier, and everybody's dealing with. I've been really incredibly impressed with the industry's, what I've seen as the industry's response anyway to dealing with COVID. One of my companies has just estimated that they've spent about $1 million on COVID compliance issues, and for, you know, it's a good sized company, so it's not necessarily a big spend in relative terms, but this thing about having more than one person in the cab of a truck, all the companies I'm dealing with, that's gone. Nobody, one person in a cab, and you might say, well, that's not practical for me. It's not practical for them either, but it's mitigating the risk. And I've just been amazed, really. These people have moved. It's almost like COVID compliance has just become an extension of safety. And contractors are so good at safety anyway, that it's really just been like an organic thing. And I've been impressed with how people are handling it. So it's really good stuff, but make sure that you are thinking about that aspect of things as well. And obviously, I'll come back and talk about the people side of this in just a minute, but let's talk about your game plan and move to that slide for just a second. You might remember a famous quote from Eisenhower, President Eisenhower, who said famously that plans are pretty worthless. You know, no plan survives the first shot of the enemy. But planning itself is invaluable. And I think that every company I'm dealing with, when they look at 2021, the year that's coming up, and the planning that's getting ready to be done for that year, I don't know anybody that's doing a static, you know, this is our projection for 2021, this is our business plan. Literally everybody I know has got at least 3 scenarios for 2021. And a lot of them have built into those scenarios, you know, say best case, worst case, most likely. What are the trigger points about, you know, what would happen in our business if revenue went down a certain level, if gross margin went down a certain level, if we felt like we had X amount of turnover, whatever the trigger point might be. But they built in sort of flashing lights that if those lights go off, that's when they're taking action. So the idea is multiple scenarios and ideas of when you would act on those scenarios so that you kind of thought about it before you get into it, which I think will potentially help how you respond as an organization during the course of the year. So it's a way to think in advance, but also stay fluid at the same time. Let me talk about the next slide on the M&A side for just a second. We mentioned this earlier, and I should clarify here, there's a bullet in here that talks about private equity not being interested. That's probably not very well said. Private equity does have an interest in the construction industry aggregated. They are invested in several hundred different construction companies across the United States, but none of those companies are what we think of as sort of typical contracting type enterprises. They're not interested in a company that gets a project or 10 or 20, but then burns them off and has to go get another 10 or 20 or 1 or whatever the number is. They're a project-based company, and especially one that's got a bond work. All those things are negative for them, and the margins are not high enough to attract them. So the companies that private equity are attracted to in the construction industry tend to be esoteric companies that we probably don't think of day to day, but they actually have higher earnings capacity, they have repeat business, they have built-in client base, and they don't have surety bonding to contend with and the associated balance sheet issues that come with all that. So there is some interest, but it's not in the sort of the normal things that we would associate with typical contracting. Having said all that, there will be some M&A activity, but I would expect that it's probably going to slow in this industry. And M&A activity in the construction industry does not typically march to the same drummer as what you read about in the newspaper with Wall Street or anything else. It's kind of got its own cadence, and it has to do with what's going on as you might imagine, in the cycles of the industry itself. So let me talk a little bit beyond that. Let's talk about your decision making for just a second and kind of getting ready. The key here that we're advocating is probably pretty obvious, but there was a fellow many years ago that talked about the paradox of management. The paradox of management was that all management, everybody leading an organization, has got to make decisions about the future. But the paradox is all the information we have to make those decisions is in the past. And that's always the case. But particularly as we confront uncertainty, we have to make decisions based on what we know. And we have to, make our best bets, really. So one thing I would encourage you to be having in the back of your mind, and I don't think you're going to have to get to it yet, and maybe you won't have to get to it. I hope not. But it could be that you're going to have to get to a place where your cost structure has to be recalibrated. I don't know that. I can tell you in 2008, most people did. FMI did back then, and I was at the helm of it, and I had to deal with that myself, and it's unpleasant, to say the least. I also had a lot of clients. General building contractor that I worked with forever down in Miami comes to mind. They probably moved. I remember sitting around in a room with them in 2008, in the fall of 2008, talking about what they were going to do, and they said, everything we do is in South Florida. We don't like to go out of South Florida. You find this amazing. This company did in 2007, 2008, probably about $900 million and never left South Florida, which is kind of staggering to think about. But they looked at what was coming and they said, first of all, we're not leaving South Florida. And second of all, we wouldn't be good at it if we did. And third of all, we're not going to fight the market and just go down to the lowest common denominator. So that company did, after the burning off that backlog, I think the next year the revenue was probably about 60% of what it was pre-recession. They did probably the best job of any company I've ever seen in my life, reducing their cost structure and doing it fast and hard and once, which is important. You have to keep going back to the well. That causes all kinds of problems. So you have to calibrate what you're doing if you get to that, but you don't want to move multiple times if you can prevent it. You want to think hard about what really has to happen. My experience is you go, all companies of all sorts in an up cycle, which we've been in, you tend to have niche players. You tend to be moving fast. You tend to be spending money to make some money. And if you really step back and look at it, I don't know anybody that can't get 10% out of their overhead and not think too hard about it. You got to go beyond that 10%. It starts to get hard. So you really have to take, a close look at that and take a surgical look at it, not just across the board, but where does it make sense? I was intrigued. This company, by the way, it's an interesting thing back then, but they cut all kinds of costs. They cut stuff that I would say was even just kind of maybe symbolic. But one of the things I remember is they cut out all FedEx, UPS, any kind of courier. Now, Ward & Smith lawyers just finished telling us that we got to have some of them to deliver certain kinds of notices, and that could well be the case. You got to have some of it. But how much FedEx is spent in a given company just because people get sloppy and say FedEx it? And yet we live in an electronic world. But it's just little things like that that add up, and you don't really think about it. The other thing I would think needs some calibration and some thought is how do you get into or prevent yourself from getting into a situation where you're in effect fighting the marketplace. And what I mean by that is there are more bad deals floating around. There are more low bids. The low bids are proverbially, they're coming in well below anybody's reasonable cost. And should we be taking stuff like that into the backlog? of course, it's easy to say no, but it's hard when you're running a business to actually know where to draw that line. I personally think that there's so much risk stapled to what most of you do that you have to be able to see some way that you can either fight your way into the black, or there's some potential of imbalancing the bid so that if the people buy something a certain way, you've got some upside. Highway contractors are famous for that, right? They put all the margin into a unit price that may or may not get bought. So they're taking a risk, but if it gets bought, then they got a lot of margin coming in terms of how they balance the bid. But be careful about fighting the marketplace. The marketplace can take you down. The marketplace does not care whether you make money or not. And you can see that every time there's a bid opening. So be very, very careful about that aspect of things. I'll tell you, this is more of an opinion than it is anything very scientific, but there's also the debate that comes up. If you get to having to reduce headcount, how are you going to do that? Or reduce, basically your people costs. And most of our overheads in people, and we all know that. So what about just taking everybody's salary down across the board? And how do you contrast that with fewer people? And I'm not, I'd be the last one to tell you that there's a right answer, because I don't think there is. But I'll tell you an opinion I have is that a lot of it gets down to whether you believe in meritocracy or not, and whether you believe that your organization has got a normal distribution of talent. And I can tell you as a longtime consultant at heart, every organization has a normal distribution of talent. What that means is you've got 10, 20% on the tail end of that distribution that's just really not that good. And so when you cut salaries across the board, what you're tending to do is to tell, it's a little bit like socializing what you're doing. And I think that's a mistake, honestly, if you are trying to run a meritocracy. But, that all of that can certainly be debated, but it's something to think about. Let me talk about one last thing in terms of preparing for the future as we get into this. Most of this, I think we probably touched on one way or the other. But one of the things I observed back in the spring, and it was interesting, and I thought it was really good, but every construction company I came across or had anything to do with, all of the communication to the troops was taken over by the CEO. And the CEOs jumped out front and took it over almost 100% and didn't let the message get garbled through their management layers. At least as much as possible. I thought that was a great thing. I think that is a great thing. You think about great leaders, not just in business, but in general. A lot of great leaders went down in history as great leaders, not because they took their companies through the good times, but because they took their companies through the tough times. And you can think of all kinds of examples of that in companies. You can think of all kinds of examples in society. From Churchill to Lincoln to whoever you might want to envision. But, anybody can steer the boat when things are going well. Steering the boat when things are not going well, that's when real leadership is required. And real leadership, at least in part of it, is your ability to communicate effectively with your people in whatever manner that takes. If it means that you're like one of my companies who puts an app out on everybody's phone and the CEO does video push to them every single day almost, or if you just need to go out to job sites more than you normally do, however you get it done, it's really not so much important how as that you get it done. You literally cannot over communicate as a leader, no matter what the cycle is. But in down times, it's almost job one. You're going to be expected to not only make hard decisions, you're going to be expected to be able to get your organization to accept those hard decisions and follow you in terms of your strategy and your direction for how you're going to get through things and bring your company out through the other side. So your leadership skills are going to be really, really in need. And I wish you the best as you deal with that. don't discount, as part of your leadership, don't discount things that are symbolic. We are all human organizations. We're all human beings. And the way we function as human beings is we follow other human beings. It's just the way we're hardwired, you know? And there have been studies that have proven over and over and over again that people take their, signals. There's a debate about money. Well, what is money? Well, money means different things to different people. But what it always means is when it's assigned by top management, it's even if you're not motivated by money, you just assume that that's what top management is focusing on. And so you try to do it, you know? So what the leader communicates is like powerful to the 10th exponent. And there are things that are symbolic that are part of that communication. What does your equipment look like? How do you keep your job trailers? I think tough times, it's even more important that we uphold high standards, and that those high standards are visual, and that those high standards are communicable to the people that matter the most, which is the people doing the work. One of the companies I work with is sit on their board is it's a big, heavy civil transportation type of outfit. And if you go in their job trailers and you look at the typical posters on the wall and stuff like that, they have done just a remarkable job of, they don't just talk about safety, they have pictures of people, hard hats, with their children and their wives, their family photos. And it'll say, and it'll have a testimonial from whoever the worker is that says, this is what it means for me to be home safe tonight, which is the motto inside the company. So they make things personal, and they keep the standards high, and they keep the communication robust. And I think if you do those things, you'll be doing a lot of what you need to be doing on the people side of the equation. So thank you for your forbearance in listening to me and walking through these slides with me. I hope these thoughts will help you. I know a lot of them sound like it's preparation for a down cycle, but frankly, it is. I think one way or the other, it's going to be necessary. I don't think you'll have to hit it too hard until the backlogs start to burn off, but it's going to happen. So I hope that's helpful in terms of thinking. If anybody wants to talk or has any questions, I love to be contacted. This is one of the beautiful things about hanging out with the Ward and Smith people is I get to sleep in my own bed at night and stay off airplanes and talk and meet with people in North Carolina, which I love to do. So it's fun for me. I love talking with you. And again, thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you so much for your thoughts and insights, Hank. So moving into our last session of the morning, we're going to take the remainder of our time to open the floor to you, our attendees. I'll also at this time invite all of our speakers back to our virtual stage. And we have received a few questions during the 2 previous sessions, but if you haven't yet submitted a question or one comes to mind during this discussion, please type it into the Q&A box located at either the top or bottom of your screen, and we'll take the time to address it. So our first question comes from the audience, and it's going to be directed to Ken Gray. And the question is, should we have force majeure clauses in our employment agreements?
Well, you certainly heard during Merrill and Evan's presentation about the necessity to consider force majeure clauses in your construction contracts with your customers. And it certainly is something that should be considered in employment agreements as well. Prior to COVID-19, we never saw force majeure clauses in employment agreements. But since the pandemic, we certainly have been putting them in certain contracts. The consideration is, when you promise somebody they're going to get paid $80,000 a year as an exempt employee, and their performance or their compensation is not tied to certain deliverables, then they're expecting to get that $80,000. And if there's a hurricane or any other act of God or a pandemic and the business is slowed down, then those people still expect to get paid $80,000. So a force majeure clause would allow the company to do something different and perhaps agree to some scaled back approach. And that's pretty much what we've done with some employers. Just take into mind, though, that it will make the contract not as appealing to the employee. So if that is a factor and you're trying to recruit some high-level performer, then it may be deemed as a negative, but it certainly was something that many employers that I dealt with back in March and April had wished they had in their employment agreements.
Thank you very much, Ken. So our second question is related to PPP. And the question is, what level of documentation is needed to show that PPP funds were actually spent on payroll costs? So I'll direct that question to Tom or Bill, whoever would like to jump in.
Sure, Jen. Good question. So back to what I presented on in terms of documentation, again, I'm sure for most PPP borrowers, the number one cost that they spent the loan on was payroll costs. And to document that, you have to keep in mind a few things. Number one, payroll cost has a specific definition under the Paycheck Protection Program. So for example, when you show that you've spent the loan on payroll costs, you want to show that per employee, no employee received more than the cap on compensation during the covered period. If you recall, there's a cap on employee compensation in excess of $100,000 annualized per pay period. And to show that, you're going to want to have bank account statements, third-party payroll provider services, their reports, tax forms 941 that you have either filed or will file for the applicable period. And again, show your work and show that the loan was used for specific payroll costs that are eligible under the program.
Thank you very much, Tom. For our next question, it just came in live and it's directed to Hank. Hank spoke about the risk of clients. Do you have any suggestions for best practices when vetting private clients?
Maybe top of the head, I think the private clients, if you can find out who has worked for them before as a contractor, you might want to call them. There are other even if you're a general contractor, for example, you may have subcontractors that maybe work through a different general, but have got some perspective on what it's like to work under the umbrella of a given entity. You certainly can also do some, in today's world, due diligence on their senior management team in terms of the people at the top and how the decisions are being made. I think you also get some insight in the, if you're negotiating private work, as to what people are willing to do. And I just give you a quick example, but my Miami client will not solidify a GMP on a building until 80% of that building has been bought out. Now, at that point, and it's actually in the contract, and they've got probably 50 other things like that I can't remember, but they've got a lot of detail of what they, that's in the contract that sort of hedges their risk and their exposure. And so you get some feelings, kind of like I think what Meryl was saying about what is the client willing to do. And some clients are take it or leave it. You know, if you don't sign it, the next guy will. And, you know, broad form, hold harmless agreements, whatever it is they're trying to shove down your throat. And there's no give at all. And I think if you start, you know, it's a judgment call, obviously, but that tells you something. So I don't know if that helps or not, but I hope it does.
Thank you so much, Hank. And while you're in the answering role, I do have another question for you. It's, if we start to feel a serious construction market contraction, at what point should we consider overhead reduction?
Good question. I think for every company, it's going to depend really on your company situation and kind of your track record. The surety companies used to keep statistics on, sort of what I'd call it mid-sized building contractors, that build in a region, let's say. If you happen to be one of those, you probably could fit a statistic that would say, if you don't have at least half your fixed overhead covered by April, and assuming you start your fiscal year January, but let's say, at the end of the first quarter, at least half your fixed overhead's not covered, that's when. Now that's a broad statistic that comes out of surety companies, and they're good at keeping those kinds of statistics. For everybody else, though, it's a little bit of a judgment call. What I suggest you do, and it's not hard to do, but go back in your history and look at how much backlog you carry into a given year versus your revenue for that year, and try to come up with your own rules of thumb about what you need going in. And it's not just revenue going in. Remember, it's gross margin. That's more important. How much gross margin do you have to cover the overhead? The other thing you can track as you go is track what I call your bill to burn ratio, which will tell you, how much are we able to get out in terms of revenue versus how much we're burning off. And that's a good thing to just keep track of. Between those two things, I think that will help you hone in on it.
Thank you so much, Hank. We did have a question that came in and was answered privately in the chat box, but I thought that our attendees could benefit from hearing both the question and the answer. And the question is for Luke. The question was, do notices of payment need to be issued by certified mail, or is email with a read receipt sufficient?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the statute actually requires that the notices of payment be sent by mail, FedEx, UPS, or registered mail with a return receipt. And the best practice is to make sure that you're getting a notice or a receipt of delivery when you send those notices of payment. I think sending an email with the mailed notice is a good idea. It's definitely not going to be harmful to send an additional notice, but that notice needs to be sent by mail as required by the statute.
Thank you, Luke. And we'll direct our last question of the morning to Whitney. That question is, what is the financial picture within the NCDOT looking like now? Has the agency begun to recover from its cash crunch?
Thanks, Jen. That's a great question. The financial picture at DOT is much improved at this point. After House Bill 77 passed in late June and then Governor Cooper signed it into law in early July, the agency was immediately infused with a significant amount of state funds from the general fund that allowed it to rise above the cash flow minimum that was triggered by state statute. And so that froze the agency's finances essentially from the end of April through early July, which meant that no new funds could be obligated and no new contracts could be entered. That trigger is now no longer effective now that the agency is above the cash floor. So most of those projects are restarting. If you have one that was put on hold because of that issue with the agency, you can give us a call and we can try to help you get it unfrozen. We've done that successfully for a few clients. The only hiccup we've really seen, that it's a unique situation, but for contracts that were entered into during that freeze, so from late April through the first week in July, if funds were obligated during that time, there may be an issue of whether those contracts are valid because the agency really didn't have the legal authority to obligate funds during that period because they were below the cash floor. So that's been a little tricky. We've helped some clients navigate that, but for the most part, the agency is in much better financial shape than it was a few months ago. Ridership is almost back to pre-pandemic levels. There was a huge surge of folks going to renew those DMV, their licenses and their plates at the DMV as soon as folks begin to feel safe doing that again. So the typical mechanisms by which the agency receives funding are mostly flowing again in the way that they were pre-pandemic. I think the only change we'll see going forward is that the direction from the General Assembly has really changed in terms of how they advise the agency to spend their money. Originally, or for the last 5 or 6 years or so, the direction from the legislature was spend the funds as fast as you can, deploy road projects as quickly as you can. And after the cash crunch that they found themselves in over the last year, which wasn't entirely due to the pandemic, but obviously that was a big part of it. Now, I think you're seeing a much more cautious tone from the legislature, and they're asking the agency to be a little more balanced and cautious and as they enter into new agreements for construction of new road projects. So much better picture than it was a few months ago, but I don't think we'll return to the aggressive contracting that we saw pre-pandemic for some time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Whitney. And thank you to all of our speakers for their wisdom and insight this morning. And thank you to all who attended for spending the first part of your morning with us. As I mentioned at the beginning of the conference, we host this conference to provide value. We want to highlight issues that impact you directly. And most of all, we want to be your trusted advisors when you need assistance with those issues. Following today's webinar, you will be sent an email with a list of articles related to the issues discussed today and other helpful information. We also will make a recording of this webinar available. We appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. Thank you again, and this concludes our 2020 construction conference.